shift in thinking, shift in teaching. As we discussed in earlier modules, the CCSSM and state testing based on the CCSSM has brought about a shift in thinking and a shift in teaching for the nation's teachers. In the past, before the 2013 release of the Common Core state standards for mathematics, state tests were given to determine if students could calculate correct answers. The answers were void of meaning. Students were simply called on to manipulate numbers. If students understood what an answer meant, was often not tested. And as a result, teachers used class time to cover the content found on the test. Teachers taught students how to use algorithms to find right answers. All of that has shifted. Today's testing is based on the standards, and the tests are being developed to test students' ability to make sense of math. Like this Frank and Ernest cartoon, before CCSSM, math was trapped in a shell. CCSSM is breaking open that shell, and math is becoming a part of life. The shift in thinking brought about by the standards is turning the classroom focus to real-life problem solving and to expecting students to show what they think, what they understand, through the use of mathematical models. The goals for Mathematical Practice 4 is that students would practice the following. First, that students will actively use math to make sense of daily life, not just work with numbers to find answers and move on to working with more numbers to find more answers, but in line with Mathematical Practice 1, that students will make sense of situations and do so actively and in their everyday lives. Second, that students will use various forms to interpret problems. They'll use objects, pictures, numbers, words, symbols, and so on. Though teachers have traditionally modeled what concepts mean to try to advance students' learning, brain research shows that this only works for some students some of the time. When they are able to internalize what someone else is doing, it works. But most students find a hard time doing this. Students will only develop and use Mathematical Practice 4 if they create their own models based on their own understanding. Third, students will represent situations and solve problems in more than one way. We teachers must be mindful that there are multiple ways to model a math concept or strategy. How to model their understanding is what's meaningful for them. For some students, our way of understanding might just as well be expressed in a foreign language that they cannot understand. Fourth, students interpret visual, verbal, and symbolic representations. When they see visuals, they understand what they mean. When they hear explanations, they make sense of what's said. When they consider numbers, they know what they present. Fifth, that students would communicate with models, that they would express the reasonableness of their solutions using models to show how their situation, how their solution makes sense in light of the beginning problem. And lastly, use models and words to communicate understanding. These are the goals we'll explore and unwrap in this module. As this poster suggests, the goal is that students learn to model with mathematics, that students can recognize math in everyday life, that students would use the math they know to solve problems, that students learn to use multiple models, pictures, symbols, concrete objects, words, to solve everyday problems. This poster will help students to understand what's expected of them. Again, the goal is for students to model with mathematics. Nancy Wolfe, a math consultant who wrote a book on math modeling, laments the common misconception among teachers that causes them to use manipulatives to model meaning for students, thinking that students will understand if they're shown meaning with manipulatives or are guided on how to use manipulatives to show meaning. For example, I've seen teachers tell students to take, say, 2 cubes, put them on a mat, students comply. The teacher then tells students to take 3 more cubes and put them on the same mat, and the students comply. And while I watched, the teacher then said, "Count how many cubes you have on your mat." And when students complied and said they had 5 cubes, the teacher thought that students had learned to add. Not so. In contrast, according to Mathematical Practice 4, modeling is to be generated by students. As we discussed in one of our earliest modules, the way students develop conceptual understanding is by working and laboring and struggling to develop and show their own thinking, their own understanding. Students need to mentally visualize and then turn mental thought and visualization into concrete representations through drawings, words, numbers, and the like. A teacher might show the child the meaning. However, as much as the child copies what the teacher did, that child is not building meaning. It is not until the students direct their own modeling that they begin to understand. You may wonder, does this mean that I should not show students how to use manipulatives to show meaning? Good question. Do share with students how you show meaning using a model. But, and this is a big but, have them then show the meaning for something else using the same model. We will get into this in more detail when we discuss Mathematical Practice 5. But for Mathematical Practice 4, let me repeat this important point. It is not until students direct their own modeling that they begin to actively use math to make sense. Note that in the picture on this slide, both the teacher and student are using Unifex cubes. This is not to suggest that modeling always involves concrete materials. Rather, this shows one way that students might demonstrate what they're thinking. The pyramid on this slide illustrates the fact that, contrary to the emphasis of CCSSM, the most frequent type of math engagement found in today's classroom is computation. The next most frequent is word problems, followed by problem solving, and finally, mathematical modeling. In the next few slides, I will clarify the differences between these various types of math engagement. The first type of math engagement we look at is computation. That is, carrying out a procedure or applying an algorithm. For example, 4 plus 5 equals 9 without context or meaning. This is the most frequent engagement with math and the least important, the least aligned with sense-making. The next most frequent type of mathematics practiced in classrooms is engagement with word problems. Though word problems use computation, like the lowest level of math engagement, word problems are more demanding than simply manipulating numbers to get another number. Word problems give a context. For example, again using the numbers 4 and 5. A word problem might read, Tony has 4 marbles and Raphael has 5 marbles. How many marbles do they have together? Word problems give a context, but that context is not necessarily realistic. Word problems are usually solved one way, using a particular procedure or algorithm. Less frequent than word problems or computation alone, problem solving requires greater sense-making and deeper understanding than word problems. Problem solving requires more reasoning and strategic thinking than word problems. When engaged in problem solving, students are expected to explain their reasoning and justify their procedures. In computation, there's just one way that students might choose to represent a situation, whereas the option is open to using other ways besides algorithms to understand and solve problems. For example, a problem might be as follows, again using the numbers 4 and 5. Principal Black asked our class to make signs for next week's game night. He wants signs to hang in each business on our street and signs to put on each door coming into our school. In your small groups, make plans for how we will do what Principal Black wants us to do. The number 4 would be decided on by students after counting up the number of businesses on the same street as our school, and the number 5 would be decided on by students after counting up the number of entrance doors to the school. As well, students would figure out how to solve the problem and would implement this real-life context. Mathematical modeling might include computation. It's probably expressed in words, but it's more than that. And modeling includes problem solving, but goes beyond. Like problem solving, modeling requires students to interpret what is needed to solve the problem and requires finding the answer. But in addition, modeling requires the development of a model. According to Schwartz, students develop a model and then they use that model to analyze the problem situation. They use the model to draw conclusions, and they use the model to assess the reasonableness of their conclusions. Modeling is not just another word for word problems or for problem solving. The key word is model. When students incorporate a model into problem solving, they're engaged in mathematical practice 4, modeling with mathematics. For example, consider the problem given for problem solving that requires students to use different models to show what the problem means and how to solve the problem and how to communicate the solution to that problem. For example, we might take the problem about Principal Black and we would add, show your understanding in 3 different ways. That would be an example of mathematical modeling. Teacher-generated tasks. As you may have surmised from the above discussion, the teacher's role is to find or generate real-life tasks for students to model. To make sense of real life, students need problems from real life to represent and solve. Criteria for such problems are that they, first, are interesting, motivating, and challenging for all students. Tasks that are naturally differentiated. We may need to provide some scaffolds for lower performing students and where high performing students are to also continue to be challenged and will not solve the problem task quickly and easily. In addition to being interesting, motivating, and challenging for all students, the tasks are set in a context in which students have some real-life experience. Do you think a task about Mary and John counting cows real life? If you thought that depends on who my students are and what we're studying, you are correct. Students would have real-life experience if your school is in a farming community where students' daily lives include some contact with cows, or if you're studying farms and visited a farm, or if you've been reading a story or learning a poem about farms and cows. But if your students have no real experience with cows, change the problem to include a context with which they're familiar. Compose problems that are real life for your students. Real life for you may not be real life for your students. For example, I suggest avoiding problems about dads if 90% of your students don't know their fathers. Change a problem about riding a bike if none of your children ever rode a bike. Be sensitive. Be aware of your students and create problems about them and their daily lives. And lastly, generate or find tasks that are open to a variety of approaches and representations, where students can show their understanding using a variety of models. When problems are open to multiple approaches and multiple ways of showing understanding, we automatically meet the call for differentiated instruction. Each student has the freedom to approach the problem for his or her way of understanding, thus increasing each student's possibility for success. Require students to develop models, to analyze problem situations, to draw conclusions, and to assess the reasonableness of their conclusions. Compose tasks that guide students into the realization that math is real life and that meaning can be represented using mathematical models. Word problems versus modeling tasks. As I read the following problems, think about which is a word problem and which is a modeling task. Think about why you think this. A, you are allowed to have friends over for a play date. What are the possible combinations of boys and girls you could invite? Did you classify this problem, as a modeling task? Why? Did you notice that it's open-ended, and as such it could be challenging for the lowest performing students as well as the highest performing students? Did you notice that students decide for themselves how to solve the problem, leaving openings for various strategies and ways of showing understanding? And did you notice that this problem could be real life for most, if not all, students? If it doesn't fit your students, you could simply change the wording to, for example, involve students in inviting class friends to sit with them or play with them during some school event. The only alteration needed here is to require students to model their understanding. How about B? Question B. Here's the problem. There are 5 children. Some are boys and some are girls. What are the possible combinations of boys and girls? Think about this. Is this a word problem or a modeling task? How did you label this task? I see this as a high-level word problem. It has options for low and high-level students, and there are various strategies for solving and representing the problem. However, the problem doesn't address a real-life situation, a real-life purpose for combining children into various groups. And it fails to require students to represent meaning through mathematical modeling. Let's look at part C, problem C. You have 3 boys and 2 girls over for a play date. How many friends do you have over? Is this a word problem or a modeling task? How did you label this problem? Did you notice that though it has the word you, which borders on being real life, that there's only one correct answer and only one level of difficulty? Did you note that the problem would be more challenging, more real life and diverse if it were more open-ended, if it required the use of various models to convey a sense-making? You may want to revisit this when you're coming up with the problem that you would like, the modeling problem you would like your students to solve in your small group. Here are some ideas in the next few slides to get you started. In this digital age, it is possible to find a host of good and bad math tasks. Sometimes seeing what others have done helps us to come up with versions of our own. And before too long, we find that devising problems for our students is like a switch turned on in our heads. Here are a few resources to get you thinking. Remember the videos you watched in the probe to this module? Both probes gave an example of a teaching strategy called 3-act math. Act 1. These tasks typically begin with a visual, usually a video of a favorite character or a real-life situation. The video introduces the challenge and gets students interested in the problem. Often during this Act 1, students will ask questions, and they might even venture a guess. You remember on the 3-act subtraction problem, the probe for this module, the visual featured the Cookie Monster from Sesame Street, a TV program with which students would be familiar. To do this for your students, you may want to stage your own video in your classroom or school grounds with fellow teachers and other people that students see around the school. On the video, you would present a dilemma that your students would be interested in solving. I'd also like to point out the questions that the teacher on the video asked students during this first act. Questions like, What did you notice? And what information can you use to help solve the problem? After the video or some visual for Act 1, we enter Act 2. Here, students analyze the situation to dig out the information they need to answer the question. They might ask each other, what information is useful? What else do we need to know to solve the problem? They might write down questions that they have in their head. They will consider what models they might use to figure out a solution to the problem. On the subtraction video with the Cookie Monster, the students wondered how many cookies were left in the Oreo package. They asked how many cookies there were in a full package of cookies. You may have noticed that the teacher did not give this information outright, but she waited for students to ask for it. Students worked together to solve the cookie problem. They communicated their understanding to one another, and they relied on one another. The teacher circulated to ask students what they were doing and why the teacher only gave support and encouragement when needed, but she never removed the challenge. Act 3, students work out possible solutions for themselves, and they check back with the original dilemma to see if their solution makes sense. In the probe videos, during the third act, the teachers gathered everyone together on the carpet. She asked students to share their thinking and their strategies with one another. The teacher allowed the students to decide if others' solution and thinking were clear and made sense of the context of the original problem. Kindergarten example. When I found this example, I just thought what fun it would be to make videos like this for my class. Here's an example of a teacher-made video. The kindergarten teacher had a colleague join her in the game format of not knowing what to do. Act 1, the teachers disagree. Are either of the teachers right? If so, which one? Why not? What do we know? Act 2, students attempt to solve the problem. Act 3, students compare their thinking and solutions. I invite you to watch this short video to perhaps spark some ideas of your own, especially those that you can use with your students in your school. Another idea to get you thinking is the cardboard challenge. In 2012, a filmmaker met a young child entrepreneur that sparked a worldwide movement. Every year, the Imagine Foundation extends a cardboard challenge to schools and children's organizations around the globe, giving students a real-life reason for using cardboard to represent their thinking. Using cardboard to build, students engage in math from many mathematical domains, from measurement and comparison to classification and shapes, as they model and create something unique out of their cardboard. I've had students do this, the cardboard challenge, and they've loved it. One caution, though. Have an adult do the cutting, as the scissors or X-Acto knife that will cut cardboard will also cut fingers. The journal, Teaching Children Mathematics, is another great source for modeling tasks. This journal is full of many, many ideas that have been tested in real-life classrooms by real-life teachers. This is a publication of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, which is an organization that has been instrumental in moving math from computation to modeling. Through the years, NCTM has produced journals that have many excellent articles on various mathematical practices and mathematical domains, including mathematical modeling. This journal can be found in education libraries throughout the country, including the Teacher's Studio at Niagara University and online resources at Niagara. Children's literature is a great way to integrate math with reading and writing, and depending upon the topic of the book, integrating math with science and social studies. The Charles A. Dana Center offers free downloads of task ideas that incorporate children's literature into pre-K to grade 2 math classrooms. Children's literature makes real-life connections for children And the booklets offered by the STIR include modeling ideas for children to use to interpret problems and represent thinking and problem solving. There are tons of ideas on the internet, some good, some not so good. Choose carefully to assure the task meets the requirements for Mathematical Practice 4. Once you become familiar with the characteristics of a modeling task, you will recognize a good mathematically rich problem. And as you become aware of the various aspects of your kids' lives and become aware of what's going on in the school and the surrounding community, you enjoy developing your own problems. And these problems will soon become the best tasks of all. The teacher's role. In addition to believing in students' abilities and devising real-life modeling tasks, the teacher's role is to strike a balance between directing students and allowing them to struggle. This is especially key for reluctant learners who have not yet developed confidence in themselves and their abilities. For these students, be a mirror to help reluctant students see that they can be successful, that they do have the skills and the accomplishments to be proud of, and that they will become smarter through their struggles. Questioning is key. Ask the kind of questions that point students in the right direction without taking away students' power. For example, when students get stuck or when they ask questions like, "What are we supposed to do?" ask questions like, "What do the directions say to do?" Or, "What is the problem about? What are you supposed to find out?" Or, "How could you restate that problem?" Or, "Can you sketch the problem?" "Can you represent the problem using materials?" Ask students, "Have you ever seen a problem like this before?" And after asking the question, or even not asking the question, listen to students. We can guide reluctant learners by listening. As the teacher in the video guided students by listening, for example, suppose a student says to you, "I don't get it." How might you set up the situation for listening? Consider the following. When a student says, "I don't get it," or some similar comment, ask students to read the problem again and give students choices. For example, you might ask the student if they would rather make a sketch of the problem or would prefer to represent the problem using concrete manipulatives. Leave the student with the question, with the choice or the challenge. Tell them, "I'll be right back." And rather than lingering and hovering over the student, walk away for a while. This allows students to think about the problem on their own, relieving the pressure and reducing the temptation that you will step in to help. After a short period of time, do return to the student and ask, "What have you discovered?" Listen closely to what the student is saying and what this suggests about the student's understanding. Commend the student for working so hard and for getting smarter. Based on what the student says, ask another question. Maybe you'll ask, "Have you solved a problem like this before?" Or you might ask, "What does this remind you of?" Or, "What might you try next?" Or, "What makes you say that?" Or, "Tell me more." The question you ask depends upon what you learned by listening to the student. Then tell the student that you'll be back and leave that student to work on her own to advance further in the problem and to work with her peers to better understand. Return as often as is needed to listen, to understand students' thinking, so that you can provide questions that relate to students' thinking, and so guide students by listening and asking questions that are based on the student's own reasoning. Gradually letting go of your own power, catch and release. When posing a modeling problem, have students become the major scaffolds. Some refer to this as catch and release. In other words, catch students thinking in ways that make sense, and then have these students share with the class with thinking, and then release the class to continue working on a challenging problem. This involves noticing and highlighting what students do understand, having these students bring these understandings to other students' attention by having them share what they understand about what is known from the problem and what is unknown. Ask, how do you know this? Ask, what tools might be used? And why do you think this? Ask questions like, how are you thinking about this problem? And why do you think this? This will help us to notice and highlight what students do understand. Choose students to share with the group what they are thinking and what they're doing and why they're doing certain things in certain ways. Choose a variety of students that are working in a variety of ways that you might ask, oh, and how are you thinking about solving this problem? And why are you doing it this way? And how is your way different than the way someone else told us? And why do you like this way better? Without naming names, point out some things that students are doing that do not appear to be reasonable in light of the problem, and why this way does not appear to make sense. Have students discuss this, and give students the opportunity to self-correct. Making sense through the modeling process. Warwick breaks mathematical modeling down into a series of 4 steps. When students make sense through mathematical models, they, number 1, investigate and identify the problem. Number 2, they form mathematical models to help them understand, and they collect data. Number 3, they interpret the solution and they compare their solutions to the reality. Number 4, they communicate their understanding and implement the solution, comparing the sense of their solution to the sense of the original problem. In the next slides, we will briefly walk through each of these 4 steps. Investigate and identify the problem. Students need to learn to make sense of problems through the modeling process. To do this, they need to learn to investigate and identify what the problem is, and they need to make plans. They need to learn to think left, think right, think low, and think high. Oh, the things you can think up if only you try. Dr. Seuss. Modeling experts agree that identifying and investigating the problem is probably the most difficult, but the most important step in making sense of problems. Modeling is challenging because, unlike classrooms of yesterday, we need to teach students to expect and embrace struggling. We need to teach students to work through struggles, to understand problems. We need to teach students to investigate, to develop investigation skills, to seek and explore and reason, to make sense of a problem and be able to restate that problem. We need to teach students identification skills, to recognize the necessary, unnecessary parts of a problem. And after students do that, we need to hold them responsible for identifying the tools that they will need to solve the problem. We need to teach students planning skills for solving the problem. Students need to think high, think low, and left and right, and we teachers need to believe that they can do it. To model is to simplify any real-world problem into a pure mathematical form. Mathematical model translates the problem into mathematical form to make sense of the problem so it can be solved. Pure mathematical forms include various models, as we spoke about earlier, symbols and numbers, words and pictures, tables, graphs, and concrete objects. Students need to represent situations and solve problems in more than one way. I'd like to go into some detail about this so that we can understand why this is important and what this really means. Various mathematical forms represent various mathematical situations found in real life. This is why Mathematical Practice 4 calls on students to solve problems in more than one way. In fact, in multiple ways. Dan Mayer talks about math modeling in terms of levels of abstraction. In his analogy, he compares moving from the concrete to the abstract in terms of moving up the rungs of a ladder. Steen calls this the ladder of abstraction. For example, kindergarten students might be given the task of finding how many students can fit on a carpet. At the lowest level of abstraction, physical reality, is to have all students sit on the carpet and then count the number of students that are sitting on the carpet. The last number counted tells how many students are sitting there. The next higher level of abstraction is called picture of reality, would be to take a picture or a photograph of students sitting on the carpet and then count the number of students. The next rung up the ladder of abstraction would be the drawing of reality. This would involve students in drawing a picture of students sitting on the carpet and then count from the picture the number of students. The fourth level of abstraction is using objects to represent the physical reality. This involves students in using objects to reality. For example, using buttons or gummy bears or Unifex cubes, something physically concrete, to represent the physical reality of students sitting on a carpet, and then count the number of objects that represent that reality. The fifth rung up the ladder, called drawing of the objects that represent the physical reality, would have students draw the objects, circles, lines, or other physically concrete objects to represent the objects that represent the physical reality. Notice that's representing through drawing the physically concrete objects that are representing the reality. The sixth rung is using numbers and symbols to represent the physical reality, using a number symbol to represent the count of real. For example, if there are 12 children on a carpet, counting and recording the number 12. Or a child might add the number of boys, say 7, and the number of girls, say 5, using numbers and the plus sign and equal signs. Multiple representations. As is suggested by the ladder of abstractions, problem situations can be, should be, represented in multiple ways with multiple different models. Each rung on the ladder demands a different approach to the task, and as such, all abstractions work together to deepen students' understanding and increase students' flexibility with numbers and fullness of meaning. When students are required to represent real-life situations in numerous ways, they gain a multitude of tools and strategies that they might use to make sense of and solve many different real-life situations. We teachers need to consciously teach students a variety of abstractions, as suggested on this slide, by the many different models for representing a number of apples. When students learn multiple representations, they less frequently ask, "What do we do?" Or if they ask that question, we can remind them of the various strategies they used previously. We ask them which model makes the most sense to them for representing this problem. And we have them choose a representation to begin the sense-making process. If their first attempt doesn't make sense, we ask, "What other models might you try?" And we have students move up and down the ladder. They benefit from numerous experience. The goal is not, I repeat, not to eventually reach and stay at the top rung. Rather, the goal is for students to move up and down the ladder, to use multiple types of representations. The standards uses the word deconstruct when they refer to moving down the ladder from numbers and symbols to physical reality and to other abstractions of physical reality. Students are to deconstruct or model what abstract numbers represent. Let's compare early experiences with abstractions to learning how to ride a bike. When children are taught to ride a bike, they often begin with training wheels. So too with children's earliest experiences with modeling. We put the training wheels on when we model an abstraction and then require students to use that representation in a problem-solving situation. For example, suppose we want students to develop the ability to represent real objects with drawings. We might, for example, bring in a bushel of apples and allow each student to take as many apples as they wish out of the basket. We might ask students to draw the apples they took out of the basket, and then to say, how many apples did you take from the basket? And call on students to use their drawings to solve and share their solutions to the problem. And so on with each representation until students have practiced using all of the different abstractions at all of the different levels of abstraction. Note that those some abstractions are better for some problems than others. In the pre-K to 2 classroom, our job is to ensure that students learn multiple representations at various levels of abstraction. In later grades, they can then build on that understanding. A main point here is that we teachers know which level abstraction we are calling on students to use. And when students show us an abstraction or two, we can guide them to make sense of a problem using other models at other abstraction levels that they have not yet used in a particular problem-solving situation. Interpreting the solution and comparing with reality. Reality, there's that word again. When students are called on to compute answers using a process or algorithm, they suspend reality. They don't need to know what the answer means. They don't need to interpret the solution. 4 plus 3 equals 7 could just as easily say Geyer plus Gimbel equals Wabe. This is also true when students are called on to solve word problems with they are unfamiliar. For example, when kindergarten problems are about mangoes without bringing mangoes to class, or when problems are about how many palm trees when the students have never seen a palm tree, or about buying clothes when an adult buys all their clothes. Traditional math books are for students from Maine to California, Hawaii to Alaska, and as a result, much of the content that's found in traditional math books will be meaningless to your students because they live where they live, and these other locations and situations are meaningless to them. Having used textbook problems in the past, I can tell you that I spent way too much time explaining situations to students, wasting valuable math time that might spend doing math rather than explaining the situation. Note, if you need to explain the situation, change the problem so the focus can be on math. When students are expected to learn math and they don't relate to the context of the problem, they will come to the conclusion that math does not need to make sense. When the context is meaningless, memorizing one number plus another number equals a third number, students think math is not to be understood. And the scary thing is that for many teachers in the past, this is what they expected from students: number answers without meaning. In contrast, Mathematical Practice 4 expects students to consider the context of the problem and the reasonableness of the solution in relation to that context. If problems have meaningful context, then we are setting students up for success rather than failure. And confusion and fear and math avoidance will be avoided. Students cannot make sense of problems that inherently don't make sense. Avoid or revise problems that don't make sense. Let me give you an example of a problem that's often found in math education literature to assess students' approach to problem solving. The problem goes like this. 12 sheep and 13 goats are on a boat. How old is the captain? The problem sounds ridiculous. However, most primary children answer 25 years old. This answer suggests that students give little attention to the context of the problem, assuming that all the facts they need are in the problem. Through repeated exposure to traditional word problems, students know the word problem will probably require them to use the operation or algorithm that they've been practicing earlier in that same lesson. Students come to the conclusion that math does not need to make sense. Wolf would refer to the sheep and goat problem as a pseudo-contextual problem. Pseudo-contextual problems have a pseudo-context. Why, for example, would one want to know the age of the captain of a boat that has 12 sheep and 13 goats? Here's another example. According to Grade 1 Geometry Standard 3, students are to learn to describe shares using the words halves, fourths, and quarters. An example of a pseudo-contextual problem might be, you have a cookie. You share your cookie with 3 friends. What part of a cookie does each friend have? Wolf calls this a pseudo-contextual problem because most students would know from real life that they would simply get more cookies so that each friend could have a whole cookie. They would not divide their one cookie into 4 pieces. Problems need to make sense in real life so that students can interpret their solutions as reasonable and compare it to reality, compare it to the real world. In addition to interpreting the situation, comparing that situation to reality, coming up with a reasonable plan, according to Mathematical Practice 4, students should interpret the solution. It is vital to teach students to determine what their solution means. They use the context to understand the problem. They use the context to develop models to represent and solve the problem. And the final step is that they use the context to interpret the reasonableness of their solution. Context is everything. In real estate, they say the important things are location, location, location. In mathematics, the important things are context, context, context. Just as we might ask, is the house in the right location? Of a math problem, we ask, does the problem have an understandable context? Having found the solution, the final step is to communicate that solution. In many traditional math classes, the answer is the end of the story. However, according to CCSSM, the answer is not the end of the story. Students need to take one more step, and that last step is connected to Mathematical Practice 3, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. To teach students this last step, make it a routine to ask questions like, what did you just figure out? Ask this until students become familiar with asking themselves, what did I just figure out? Until students become familiar with sharing without prompting what they did figure out. To ensure students understand the meaning of their solutions, ask them to use their models to express their answers and to do so in the context of the original problem. Ask students to express their answers in complete sentences and to discuss, does this make sense? Why do you think this makes sense? As you circulate among students, ask, how do you know this is true? Can you show me why this works? And can you show me in another way? Have students share their thinking and their questioning with one another. If they're correct or incorrect, sharing their thinking deepens understanding and helps students recognize their errors. Modeling will work for you and your students. Modeling builds on problem solving. Modeling calls on students to use a variety of models to interpret and represent situations, to use models to solve problems, and to use models to communicate the reasonableness of a solution in light of the beginning problem. To guide students' growth in modeling mathematics, we teachers must design problem-solving tasks that help students to make sense of daily life. And continuing the summary, this presentation gives a few ideas to get you started on finding and designing tasks with real-life contexts that will interest and engage your students, such as the 3-act math, cardboard challenge, designing tasks that incorporate children's literature, and ideas expounded on in the journal Teaching Children Mathematics. Questioning and listening are key for guiding students to making sense of math through modeling. As we spoke about, be they struggling learners, advanced learners, and all that is in between, pre-K through grade 2 students are capable of doing modeling tasks. They are capable of learning how to climb up and down the ladder of abstractions, from the most concrete models to the most abstract. Have confidence in your students and in yourself. With rich tasks and your direction, students can make sense of the world from a mathematical perspective. It's now time to transfer your learning. As with previous mathematical practices, for this assessment of your learning, you will again plan for, implement, and videotape a teaching learning session with a group of students. You may conduct the teaching learning segment with any group of students in the age range from pre-kindergarten through grade 2, either one grade or mixture of grades within this range. This may be the same group that you worked with in the past or with a different group of students. Your choice. After your teaching learning session, you will edit your video to approximately 10 minutes and post the video on Canvas. As well, you reflect on your students' engagement in developing this mathematical practice, and 2, you will reflect on the videos of 2 of your peers. Coming attractions. The next topic that we will study is Mathematical Practice 5. Use appropriate tools strategically. As in the past, to determine your prior knowledge and to connect with the topic, complete Mathematical Practice 5.1 Probe, which is also on using appropriate tools and using them